My name is Sabra Vale, 32 years old. My heels strike the marble floor of the Portland courthouse, each step a controlled thunder meant to drown out the whispers that skitter through the gallery like mice. I keep my gaze level, the way I learned to do when I was young, and praise and judgment came with the same smile. My mother's laugh slices the hush behind me, quiet, surgical, timed. My father's silence lands heavier than any insult. And Ethan, my older brother, lounges 2 rows back like a man killing time, thumbing his phone as if none of this could possibly concern him. The Langford name hums through the room like a live wire. It always does. I sit beside federal prosecutor Sandra Miller and smooth my navy blazer with hands I refuse to let tremble. "You ready?" she whispers, eyes on the judge's empty bench. I give the smallest nod. The weight of everything I've gathered presses against my ribs. Dates, ledgers, signatures, one thin thread stitched to another until a pattern emerges. I used to think surviving this family meant perfecting my invisibility. Today I will try the opposite. It began, at least the way a story needs to begin, in 2016, the year the market sagged and my father's empire bent with it. Langford Holdings had always been his cathedral. 12 rental developments, 3 lakefront properties polished like heirloom silver, a web of holdings buffered by charm and ruthless math. When his health faltered and the numbers bled, I stepped in. I worked 18-hour days until coffee curdled my stomach and the city's lights looked like a fever. When the accounts gasped for air, I wired in $520,000 from my own savings. No contracts, no promissory note, just the naive faith of a daughter who believed loyalty was its own receipt. 3 months later, at the mahogany dining table I had dusted as a child, my mother cut tenderloin with the precision of a surgeon. My father cleared his throat without looking at me. "The board has concerns," he said, "about certain financial overreach." I laughed, an astonished, graceless sound. Overreach? I kept the company afloat. My mother dabbed her lips with linen as if blotting a spill. "You were born to follow, Sabra, not to lead." The knife slid through meat, smooth as certainty. Somewhere inside me, a hinge that had creaked for years tore off the frame. I left that night with a folder of balance sheets tucked under my arm, proof that I had not imagined my usefulness. The silence as the door shut behind me was almost gracious. I told myself I was free. But freedom in a family like mine can feel like exile with better lighting. 3 years later, the gray parcel appeared on my doorstep. No stamp, no sender, just my name printed in block letters that made my stomach dip. I carried it to my kitchen counter like a live thing. I made coffee I didn't drink and straightened coasters that were already straight. When I finally tore the cardboard, a sealed envelope slid into my hand. For her eyes only. H. Langford. I would know my grandfather's blunt capitals in a room full of forgeries. The will inside was handwritten, dated 2004. My throat tightened as I read the simple, devastating sentence. "I, Henry Langford, do hereby bequeath all properties, holdings, and assets to my granddaughter, Sabra Vale." I set the page down and picked it up again, as if the words might rearrange. Grandfather had died 6 years ago. I had sat in the back of a paneled probate room and listened to the court read a very different will, one that swept everything to Ethan. I remembered my mother's hand resting on my father's sleeve, a gesture of support that looked like ownership. I opened my laptop and pulled the probate record, laying it side by side with the paper in my hands. The signatures were close enough to pass a glance, not close enough to elude scrutiny. The way the H carved its first stroke, the closing tail on the G, the slight lift in Langford. I saw them the way a pianist hears a wrong note. Oregon's digital will registry hadn't existed in 2004. The blind spots suddenly felt cavernous. If you knew where the walls were soft, you could push. I stared at my refrigerator's blank door until my reflection blurred. If this was real, then my brother's crown had been cut to size with counterfeit scissors. If it wasn't, someone wanted me to burn my life down chasing a lie. "Legacy isn't inherited," Henry used to say, pouring tea like a ritual. "It's built." He'd also said, more than once, that anything worth keeping should be stored twice. He dated his ledger entries in triplicate. He hid spare keys in the least romantic places, Inside, a hollow-turned leg, beneath a sun-faded paperback, once behind a painting, with a crooked right corner, he insisted no one else could see. The past lifted its head like an animal. In Henry's study, there had been a hunting scene, a stag, a fogged meadow, and that one corner always sat a fraction low. I'd thought it was my mind craving imperfection in a room designed to impress. Now the memory pulsed with a heat I didn't like. I shut my eyes and exhaled until my breath steadied. I told myself not to build cathedrals out of hunches. That night, I slept like a person listening for footsteps. In the morning, my phone vibrated on the counter like it was trying to escape. "Is this Sabra?" a voice asked, male, raspy with age and cigarettes. "Who's asking?" I said, already moving toward a pen. "Caleb Warner. I worked for Henry's attorney, the one who disappeared in 2009. A dull roar filled my ears. "What do you know about that?" A pause that felt like the moment before a bridge groans. "He refused to alter the will," Caleb said softly. "That's why he vanished. I've been afraid to come forward. I can't live with it anymore." There are moments when your life rewrotes with frightening efficiency. I looked at the will, at the blocky letters that had once scrawled birthday cards and grocery lists, at my own hand, braced white-knuckled on the counter. "We should meet," I said. "Bring the document," Caleb replied, and then, almost as if he were offering me the smallest mercy, he recorded everything, insurance. I booked a safe deposit box that afternoon and slid the will inside a sleeve so clear it felt like a lie. I scanned copies and stored them on 2 drives, then wrote the file names on paper instead of saving them on my computer. I labeled a manila folder evidence and laughed at myself because a manila folder labeled evidence looks ridiculous until it isn't. I knew how this would play out, how the city's polite knife work would begin once the first rumor rippled. I imagined Diane at a lunch I would never attend, sighing that I'd always struggled with stability. Her friends would tilt their heads and murmur concern. Concern travels faster than truth. Sandra Miller's name was already in my notes, an assistant U.S. attorney whose reputation for methodical patience preceded her. I had not dialed her yet. It felt like inviting a storm before checking the roof. But even as I delayed, I worked the numbers the way I'd learned in the business. Timelines, transfers, the tidy arithmetic that makes theft look like good management. When you've lived inside a mechanism long enough, you learn where the gears grind. I returned to the courthouse the next week for a hearing on a different matter, a bar complaint, 1 sentence long, lodged without fanfare, a pebble dropped into a deep well. As I walked the same long corridor, I felt eyes become needles. My mother sat behind us, pearls catching fluorescence, the portrait of a woman who had mastered benevolence as a weapon. My father stared straight ahead, jaw flexing against words he would never risk saying to a judge. Ethan glanced up, met my gaze, and gave me the smallest shrug, an old sibling code for, "Can't you just be reasonable?" I almost smiled. Reasonable had been my fluency for years, the habit of smoothing, the soft lie that kept rooms warm. The truth was colder, but it didn't disappear when you turned off the lights. At home that night, I placed Henry's will on the kitchen table and circled the L in Langford until the paper thinned. I thought of Diane's philanthropy, the scholarships and hospital wings. I thought of Graham sitting up through real estate cycles like a watchman, believing himself necessary. I thought of Ethan, who had learned that comfort is a birthright if you never ask its price. I didn't want to be their executioner. I wanted the math to balance. My phone buzzed close to midnight. Unknown number. "Sabra," Caleb said, voice frayed at the edges. "Tomorrow, 11, Riverside Cafe. Sit where you can see both doors." "All right. And Sabra?" He hesitated, as if the words had to push past old fear. "The recording. It names them. Your mother and father." He says where they got Henry's signature, how they matched it to the 1998 deed. It was tidy. It was always tidy. I glanced at the clock and pictured the courthouse's pale ceiling, the stag painting's crooked corner, my mother's smile like polished bone. Outside, the city hummed its sleepless hum. "I'll be there," I said. After I hung up, I locked the will away again and stood in my dark kitchen, listening to the refrigerator's animal purr, to the way the building settled around me as if preparing for weather. I wasn't sure which frightened me more, that I would be wrong or that I would be right. Either way, tomorrow would start a clock I couldn't stop. I turned out the light and let the room go quiet. Insurance, he had said. He recorded everything. The cafe sat on the river's edge, a narrow wedge of glass and steam pressed between office towers. I arrived 20 minutes early and chose a corner table where I could see both doors, just as Caleb had instructed. The waitress filled my mug twice without being asked. I didn't touch it. My reflection wavered in the window, superimposed over the slow crawl of the Willamette outside, a ghost waiting for an appointment that might change everything. Caleb Warner entered like a man who expected to be followed. Late 70s, stooped but alert, his blue eyes magnified by thick lenses. His coat was too large, the cuffs damp from drizzle. He scanned the room before sliding into the seat across from me. "You look like him," he said quietly. "Henry." Same eyes, same stubborn tilt of the chin. He placed a scratched flash drive between us, its metal casing scuffed by years. "This is what's left of him." I didn't move. "What's on it?" He glanced toward the window, the reflex of someone who'd learned caution the hard way. "A recording," he said. "Your grandfather's attorney made it before he disappeared. He wanted insurance if anything happened." The word again, insurance. I reached for the drive, but Caleb kept his fingers on it. "You need to understand what you're walking into. They forged Henry's will using a signature from a 1998 property deed. Your father brought it to the lawyer and told him to copy it. When he refused, your father threatened him. Diane was there, smiling, like she already knew the outcome." My throat tightened. "And the lawyer?" "He left town the next night," Caleb said. "No one ever saw him again. I was his clerk back then. I found the drive in his safe deposit box last month. My name was on the key envelope." The waitress drifted by with a pot of coffee. Caleb waited until she left before adding, "They won't hesitate to destroy you the way they destroyed him." I slid the drive into my pocket. "They already tried once." Caleb's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Then you'll need to be smarter than they expect." That night, my apartment felt smaller, the walls drawn tight around me. I set the flash drive on the counter and circled it like a wary animal. When I finally connected it to my laptop, a voice crackled through the speakers. Older, trembling, but clear. "They forced me to forge the will. Graham and Diane Langford. They had Henry's signatures from a 1998 deed. Graham said if I didn't cooperate, I'd regret it. I'm leaving town tonight. If anything happens to me..." The recording ended mid-breath, as though the man had vanished into the pause. I played it 3 times, memorizing every inflection. Each repetition hardened something inside me. I opened a spreadsheet and began mapping names, dates, transfers, Langford Holdings ledgers I still remembered by heart. Numbers had always been my language. Within hours, patterns emerged. Identical payment intervals, shell corporations registered under post office boxes, deeds shuffled like playing cards. It wasn't just forgery, it was an architecture of theft. At dawn, I walked to the bank and rented a safe deposit box. The original will and a copy of the recording went inside. I encrypted the files, stored them on multiple drives, mailed one to a friend out of state. Precautions that felt paranoid yesterday now felt insufficient. By noon, I received my first warning, a call from my mortgage lender about a review of my application from 3 years ago. An hour later, an art gallery that sold my photographs politely informed me they were re-evaluating their consignment policy. Small, precise pressures applied by invisible hands. I could almost hear my mother's voice rehearsing concern. "Sabra's under so much stress lately." I poured a glass of wine I didn't want and opened a new browser tab. Sandra Miller, Assistant U.S. Attorney. Her name glowed like a flare against the dark screen. I stared at it until my reflection blurred into the cursor. Then I began typing. 3 days later, Ethan called. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "Mom's upset. Dad, too." "I'm sure they are." "You're making things worse. There's gossip. People are asking questions." "Good," I said. "Maybe they'll get answers." He exhaled sharply. "You've always twisted things, Sabra. You don't understand how fragile Dad's health is right now." "I understand perfectly," I replied. "Tell him to save his strength for court." A pause, heavy and trembling. "Don't do this," he whispered, and hung up. That night, I returned home from the grocery store to find my front door ajar. The air inside smelled wrong. Cold metal, dust, something overturned. My living room was gutted. Drawers dumped, couch slashed, my laptop shattered across the floor. Papers drifted like pale leaves. On the table lay a single note written in my grandfather's unmistakable block letters. Legacy isn't inherited, it's earned. My stomach lurched. Not Henry's handwriting this time, but someone imitating it. A message, not a memory. I gathered the papers and locked myself in the bathroom, sitting on the floor until my pulse slowed. I wasn't naive enough to call the police. My family's reach extended well past the city. Instead, I texted Caleb. "They've been here." He replied instantly. "Then they're scared." The next morning, my inbox chimed with an unfamiliar address. smiller@usdoj.gov. Bring everything you have. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. Federal Building, room 312. I read it twice, then again, half expecting it to disappear. Instead, I printed it and slid it into the manila folder already labeled Evidence. When I walked into the federal building, the air smelled of paper and disinfectant, a bureaucratic neutrality that felt oddly safe. Sandra Miller was younger than I expected, early 40s, sharp eyes behind thin frames. Her handshake was firm. "I've reviewed your email," she said, motioning me to sit. "Forgery of a will is serious, but what you've outlined crosses into federal territory. Extortion, disappearance, potential fraud across state lines." "I don't want revenge," I told her. "I want the truth on record." "That's usually where revenge starts," she said wryly, then tapped the flash drive. "You're certain about the voices?" "Positive." She studied me a moment longer, as if weighing whether my steadiness was courage or delusion. "All right," she said finally. "We'll start by authenticating the audio. And you should know, if this proceeds, they'll come for you harder." "They already have." Something flickered in her expression. Approval, maybe pity. "Then we'll hit back harder." 2 nights later, my phone buzzed at 9 p.m. Caleb's voice cracked through static. "They know I met you," he said. "A car's been outside my house since yesterday." "Go somewhere safe." "I'm too old to run. Just promise me you'll finish what Henry started." "Caleb, shh." The line went dead. I stared at the dark screen until my reflection swam back into view. Outside, rain began to fall, gentle at first, then steady, as if the city itself were trying to wash something clean. I packed my evidence folder, the drives, and the original will into a backpack and sat at the window watching headlights smear across the wet glass. Somewhere out there, my family was tightening its net, confident that I'd break the way I always had, through exhaustion, through love. But exhaustion had turned into fuel and love into something sharper. At midnight, an email from an unknown address appeared. "Meet us at the lodge. We just want to talk. E." I closed my laptop and let the silence stretch until it became a decision. If they wanted a conversation, I would give them one. But this time, I'd bring a listener they couldn't see. I opened the voice recorder on my phone, pressed record, and whispered into the darkness, "Insurance." The road to the Langford Lodge curved through miles of forest, the headlights cutting silver lines through the trees. Rain slicked the asphalt, turning every bend into a mirror of something waiting. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went pale. The message on my phone glowed faintly in the cup holder, Ethan's words looping like an old song. "We just want to talk." I didn't believe that for a second. By the time the lodge came into view, night had deepened into that blue-black stillness that swallows sound. The house looked exactly as it had the last time I'd been dragged here for one of Diane's curated holidays. Warm lights spilling from tall windows, a perfect portrait of family unity. I parked beside Ethan's Range Rover and slipped my phone into my jacket pocket, voice recorder running. Inside, they were arranged like actors waiting for their cue. My mother at the head of the table, pearls luminous against her throat. My father opposite her, his posture tired but proud. Ethan leaning casually against the sideboard, pouring wine with a smile too rehearsed to be real. "Sabra," my mother began, her tone light. "Thank you for coming." "I almost didn't," I said, taking a seat where I could see all 3 of them. Graham cleared his throat. "We thought it was time to clear the air. All this unpleasantness has gone far enough." I glanced at the folder beside his elbow. "What's that?" Ethan slid it across the table. "A solution," he said. "Simple, clean, final." Inside was a single sheet of paper, a waiver of claims against the Langford estate. My name already printed neatly on the signature line. "Sign this," Graham said evenly, "and it's over. We'll even establish a trust for you. Not what you imagine you deserve, but enough to live comfortably." My mother sipped her wine. "You've always been so independent, dear. Think of this as freedom." I stared at the page until the letters blurred. Freedom doesn't usually come with a muzzle attached. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You're playing with fire, Sabra. This family's reputation took decades to build." "On lies," I said quietly. He slammed his glass down. "You already handled that lawyer, right, Dad?" The silence that followed cracked through the room like lightning. Graham's eyes flicked toward him. Warning, fury, fear, but it was too late. I let the moment stretch, memorizing every twitch, every breath. I stood, leaving the unsigned document where it lay. "You just confirmed everything I needed to know." "Sabra," Diane said, voice sharp now, "family loyalty still means something." "Yes," I replied, hand on the door. "That's exactly why I'm doing this." Outside, the rain had stopped. The forest held its breath. Headlights flickered once among the trees before extinguishing. I drove away, heart pounding, checking my phone to ensure the recording light was still red. Insurance. 2 days later, I sat in Sandra Miller's office, the rain now a constant drumbeat against the windows. She listened to the lodge recording through headphones, expression unreadable. When it ended, she removed them slowly. "He actually said that?" I nodded. "Every word. This changes everything." She reached for a legal pad, already scribbling notes. "Forgery's one thing. Conspiracy and obstruction? That's federal. We can move fast." Her efficiency calmed me, the way surgeons must calm patients before the scalpel. "We'll start by securing a warrant for the family properties," she continued, "particularly the Langford mansion. You said your grandfather's study might hold more evidence?" "Maybe." I told her about the crooked painting, the habit Henry had of hiding things behind art, inside drawers, beneath polished surfaces no one ever touched. Sandra smiled faintly. "Meticulous men leave meticulous secrets. Let's find them." At dawn, federal marshals gathered outside the Langford estate. Their navy jackets gleamed in the pale light, a contrast to the limestone facade looming over us. The front door opened, and my father appeared, bathrobe hastily tied, disbelief curdling into rage as he saw me among the officers. "Sabra," he rasped, "what the hell is this?" "Federal warrant to search the premises," Sandra announced, handing him the document. "Step aside, Mr. Langford." Diane appeared on the stairs, her composure cracking only in the tremor of her left hand. "This is absurd. You have no right." "We have every right," Sandra said. "Now, please." I followed the marshals through the foyer, past the chandelier that had hung like a crown over every childhood dinner. The house smelled of cedar polish and old secrets. When we reached Henry's study, I paused at the threshold. The air was thick with memory, the faint scent of tobacco, the worn leather of his chair, the ticking clock that had once marked our shared silences. "There," I said, pointing to the hunting scene above the desk. "The right corner. It's always been slightly crooked." A marshal climbed onto a chair, removed the painting, and revealed a small wall safe. "You'll need a combination," my father said behind me, voice brittle with forced calm. "It's been sealed for years." I stepped forward, fingers trembling as they brushed the cold metal. My mind turned over possibilities, dates, numbers, patterns. Henry's logic was always sentimental beneath the precision. I whispered, "May 14th, 1990. My birthday." The dial clicked, the door swung open. Inside were bundles of aged documents wrapped in ribbon, a small leather journal, and a metal USB drive. I lifted the journal first, its pages filled with Henry's tidy handwriting. Observations about business meetings, notes of concern over Graham's decisions, growing suspicion of pressure to alter estate plans. Letters followed, correspondence with his attorney about protecting me specifically. Then photographs. Henry at his desk, my mother standing behind him, dated June 2004. Sandra examined each item with care. "Chain of custody starts now," she murmured to the marshals. Finally, I retrieved the USB drive. "What's on it?" I asked. "Let's find out," Sandra said. Her tech specialist connected it to a laptop. Files appeared. Company records from 2003 to 2005, and one audio file labeled Legacy Wave. Sandra hit play. Sandra. Henry's voice filled the study, steady and unmistakable. "This recording serves as verbal confirmation of my wishes. In the event of my death, all assets and holdings of Langford Estates shall pass to my granddaughter, Sabra Vale. She alone has demonstrated the integrity to carry forward what I've built." For a moment, No one spoke. My father swayed, gripping the doorframe. My mother turned away, her shoulders trembling, though whether from fury or humiliation, I couldn't tell. Sandra exhaled slowly. That's your smoking gun. I felt the words like distant thunder. He left it for me to find. By afternoon, news had leaked. The Portland Business Journal ran a short piece questioning Langford Holdings' financial practices. My phone lit up with messages I didn't open. In the following days, the counterattack came swift and predictable. Whispers about my mental state, rumors that I'd fabricated evidence, veiled comments about my personal life. But the tide had begun to shift. An accountant from the firm that handled our books came forward with documentation of my $520,000 transfer. A former board member quietly provided meeting notes proving my dismissal had been prearranged once the company stabilized. One by one, the pieces aligned. At night, exhaustion blurred the edges of my resolve, but underneath it pulsed something fierce, a sense that the ghosts were finally stepping into the light. Sandra called one evening while I was reviewing transcripts. The judge has set an expedited court date, she said. They're panicking, Sabra. That's good for us. Good how? Desperate people make mistakes. Keep your guard up. As I hung up, my phone vibrated again. A message from Caleb. Someone followed me home tonight. I think they want me to stop. I typed back, do not meet anyone alone. Stay somewhere public. His reply was simple. Too late for that. The screen dimmed, my reflection caught in the black glass. Outside, the rain returned, steady and cold. I watched it streak down the window until my own face blurred away. They thought fear would silence me. They'd forgotten who taught me to look for crooked frames. The courthouse was colder than I remembered. The air held that faint metallic smell of fear and old paper, a scent that clung to suits and testimony alike. I took my seat beside Sandra, feeling the weight of every eye that turned toward me. Across the aisle, my family looked like a portrait painted to impress, Diane serene and polished, Graham dignified in a navy suit that hung too loose, Ethan stone-faced in his tailored jacket. Ready? Sandra murmured. I nodded, though my heart hammered hard enough to feel like defiance. The first day belonged to them. Their attorney, a man named Richards, spoke with theatrical confidence, calling my actions a tragic misunderstanding fueled by emotion and greed. He painted me as a daughter consumed by envy, desperate for validation my parents had rightfully denied. Every word was crafted to sound reasonable, civilized, sane. One by one, their witnesses took the stand. Former board members I barely knew described my erratic decisions. Family friends testified about my increasing instability, each lie layered neatly on the last, a tower of polite betrayal. Ethan followed, his eyes glassy, voice thick with practiced sincerity. I tried to protect the family legacy, he said, but Sabra was unpredictable. She'd show up to meetings in tears, accuse Dad of hiding money. We didn't know how to help her. I kept my expression still, but inside something coiled tight. He had learned manipulation from the best. Then came Diane. She wore a dove-gray suit, her pearls gleaming under the lights. Her voice quivered just enough to suggest heartbreak. All we wanted was peace, she told the jury. A family can survive almost anything except betrayal. When she said betrayal, she looked at me. Sandra placed a steady hand over mine, the silent language of hold steady. Graham testified last, his tone weary but firm. My daughter has always been headstrong, he said. When my health declined, she made choices without authorization. I was forced to intervene for the company's survival. By the time he finished, the narrative was complete. I was the ungrateful child who'd imagined monsters in her family's shadow. Richard smiled as he gathered his papers. No further witnesses, Your Honor. Judge McKinney, silver-haired and sharp, nodded toward Sandra. Your turn, Ms. Miller. Sandra rose, smooth as a blade, sliding free of its sheath. The prosecution calls Caleb Warner. A ripple of surprise passed through the gallery. Caleb's age showed in his slow steps, but his voice, once he began, held a steady, righteous tremor. He described the 1998 deed, the threats, the lawyer's disappearance. Richards objected twice, both times overruled. When Sandra played the insurance recording, the courtroom fell silent. They forced me to forge the will, the dead lawyer's voice said, thin and fragile through the speakers. Graham and Diane Langford. They used Henry's signature from a 1998 deed. If anything happens to me, The audio cut off, leaving an echo that seemed to vibrate in every chest. Diane's fingers tightened around her pearls until her knuckles whitened. Ethan looked at the floor. My father's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. Sandra turned to the judge. Your Honor, we have more. She projected a video onto the courtroom screen. Althea Monroe, Henry's elderly housekeeper, seated in her floral robe. Her hands trembled, but her voice carried conviction. I was there when Mr. Henry signed his will, she said. Mrs. Diane stood behind him the whole time, watching every move. Gasps rippled through the spectators. The timestamp flashed. June 2004. Sandra pressed forward. We also submit forensic analysis proving the 2004 probate will was forged. The signatures differ in 13 measurable points. We'll hear from our expert next. Richards rose. Objection, Your Honor. Overruled, Judge McKinney said without hesitation. The expert's overlay projections illuminated the courtroom wall, showing the two signatures superimposed, the subtle misalignments impossible to dispute. Ladies and gentlemen, the expert concluded, this is not human variation. This is replication. Sandra nodded. Thank you. She turned to the jury. Replication, a polite word for theft. She called the accounting witness next. Numbers, transfers, shell corporations. Then the former board member, who admitted under oath that my removal had been prearranged once profits stabilized. Every revelation chipped at the Langford image, the careful veneer that had taken decades to craft. By mid-afternoon, tension pulsed like humidity. Richards fumbled for objections that fell flat. Sandra gestured to the screen again. Our next exhibit, she said, is an audio file recovered from Henry Langford's personal safe. My grandfather's voice filled the room, calm and resolute. All assets and holdings of Langford Estates shall pass to my granddaughter, Sabra Vale. She alone has demonstrated the integrity to carry forward what I've built. My throat closed. Hearing him speak those words under the same roof where I'd once been dismissed as irrelevant felt like resurrection. When the recording ended, silence reigned. Even Judge McKinney looked momentarily moved. Sandra wasn't finished. One last witness, Your Honor. Jessica Barnes. A young woman stepped forward, nervous, eyes darting toward my parents. I was the assistant to the attorney who disappeared, she said. I saw documents destroyed after he refused to change the will. Mr. Langford told me if I ever spoke, no firm would hire me again. Richards leapt up. Objection, hearsay. Overruled, the judge said sharply. Continue, Ms. Barnes. She swallowed. He wasn't bluffing. I lost my job 2 weeks later. By the time Sandra rested her case, the family's composure had cracked. My mother's mascara smudged beneath her eyes. My father sat rigid, chest rising in shallow breaths. Ethan's foot tapped under the table, a staccato rhythm of panic. The judge called for recess until morning. As the gavel fell, Sandra leaned close. Tomorrow we present the final piece. Caleb found new evidence late last night. The missing lawyer's final notes. They link your father's threats directly to Henry. I stared at her. Then it's over. She shook her head. Not yet. Truth still has to survive daylight. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood at my apartment window watching the city glitter, thinking of how many stories played out behind those lights, families protecting reputations, silencing dissent. I wondered how many daughters had been told they were overreacting, how many truths had been buried under good manners. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You've made your point. Walk away while you can. I deleted it without replying, but my pulse refused to slow. I poured tea, sat at the table, and unfolded Henry's old letter one more time. If she stands before you, she has already carried more weight than any man in this family. His faith steadied me more than any law could. The next morning, the courthouse overflowed. Reporters lined the steps. Flashbulbs painted the air white. Inside, tension hummed. Richards looked pale, his bravado dulled. Sandra stood as the judge entered. Your Honor, the prosecution submits newly recovered evidence, a written statement by the late attorney who drafted Henry Langford's will. Gasps spread like wind through dry grass. Judge McKinney adjusted his glasses. Proceed. Sandra read aloud. Graham Langford visited my office on June 16, 2004, demanding changes to his father's will. When I refused, he threatened my family. He said the old man's mind was failing and no one would question him once he was gone. If anything happens to me, this letter is proof of intent. Richard scrambled to object, voice cracking. Forgery! That could be anyone's handwriting. Our handwriting expert has verified it, Sandra replied calmly. The judge's gaze swept the room, his tone final. Objection overruled. The statement is admitted. Graham's complexion turned ashen. Diane reached for his hand. He didn't take it. Ethan stared at me, and for the first time there was no anger, only something hollow, almost frightened. Judge McKinney leaned forward. We will recess for deliberation. Verdict will be delivered at first call tomorrow. He struck the gavel once. I exhaled for the first time all day. The noise of the courtroom faded to a low roar around me. Sandra squeezed my shoulder, eyes fierce. Tomorrow, she said, truth takes the stand. And for the first time in years, I believed her. The courthouse was silent when the verdict came. No murmurs, no whispers, just the rhythmic tick of the courtroom clock echoing through marble and air. I sat so still I could hear my own heartbeat, steady as the second hand. Sandra's hand rested lightly over mine, a silent anchor. Across the aisle, my family, the Langfords, looked smaller than I'd ever seen them. Judge McKinney adjusted his glasses and spoke, each word a measured strike. This court finds substantial evidence of forgery, obstruction of justice, and elder coercion. The rightful heir to the Langford estate is therefore restored, Ms. Sabra Vale. All holdings are to be transferred immediately. Criminal charges will be referred to the district attorney for prosecution. His gavel fell like thunder. My mother gasped softly. My father's face drained of color. Ethan closed his eyes, shoulders sagging as if the weight of our family's myth had finally crushed him. The courtroom rippled with shock and the clicks of reporters' cameras. Sandra squeezed my fingers once, firmly. It's over, she whispered. But it didn't feel over. Not yet. Diane's voice cut through the noise, brittle and desperate. You promised this would never happen, she hissed at my father. Her pearls trembled as she turned on me. You've ruined everything. I stood, my knees surprisingly steady. No, Mother, I said quietly. You did that yourselves. Outside the courthouse, the sun glared off the reporters' cameras. Questions flew. How did it feel? What would happen next? Did I plan to press criminal charges? I said nothing. The truth didn't need my commentary anymore. It had spoken for itself. 3 months later, the headlines faded. The Langford scandal had been absorbed into the city's appetite for gossip, but the aftermath lingered in quieter ways. My father surrendered his real estate license 2 days before the stroke that left his right side paralyzed. Diane disappeared from every charity board without explanation, retreating to a smaller house by Lake Oswego, the same lake she once boasted about owning property on. Ethan moved east, to Bend. Last I heard, he was working construction, building modest homes on land our company used to sell for millions. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. And me? I stayed in Portland, but the city felt different now. The skyline no longer carried my father's shadow. My loft still smelled faintly of coffee and cedar, but the air was lighter. The will, the recordings, the affidavits, they were all locked away now, sealed evidence of a story that had finally found its ending. One evening, I drove back to Crystal Lake. The same winding forest road, but this time, the fear was gone. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. The lodge stood empty, its windows dark, reflecting only the sky. I walked to the dock, the wooden boards groaning under my steps. The lake shimmered in twilight, perfectly still. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out Henry's note, the original, the one that had guided me through every betrayal. The paper was soft at the edges, the ink faded but legible. Legacy isn't inherited, it's earned. I struck a match, let the flame catch the corner, and watched it curl into ash. The wind carried the gray fragments across the water. They laughed when I walked in, I murmured, remembering that first day in the courtroom. But they weren't laughing when I walked out. For the first time in years, my chest loosened. I could breathe again. Weeks later, I signed the papers establishing the Langford Foundation for Legal Integrity. We provided free legal aid for those crushed by power, whistleblowers, caregivers, disinherited sons and daughters, too small to fight the empires that silenced them. Sandra joined as legal advisor. Caleb's name topped the board in memoriam. Althea's testimony, her voice trembling but clear, became the foundation's motto. The truth always leaves a witness. The irony of using the Langford name wasn't lost on me, but maybe that was the point. Names could be reclaimed, legacies could be rewritten. A year later, I stood in front of a classroom at the University of Oregon, chalk dust coating my fingers. 28 law students stared back at me, notebooks open, eyes bright with curiosity. I wrote 2 sentences on the board. Integrity builds legacy. Legacy isn't given, it's built. They'd read about my case in their textbooks. Some looked at me like a myth. I smiled, an unpolished, genuine smile that would have scandalized my mother. Law, I told them, isn't about winning. It's about remembering who you are when the world tells you to forget. When class ended, I lingered by the window. Outside, students crossed the campus lawn, laughter threading through sunlight. It was the same sound that had once wounded me at our family dinners, my mother's perfect practiced laugh. But here it sounded different, pure, uncalculated. The quiet that followed was not the kind that suffocates. It healed. Later that night, I drove once more to Mount Calvary Cemetery. Henry's headstone gleamed under the moonlight, simple gray granite etched with his name. I knelt and placed fresh roses at its base. I did it, I whispered, not for revenge, for truth. A breeze stirred the petals. The city lights glimmered in the distance, and for a heartbeat, I imagined his voice again. Warm, amused, proud. If she stands before you, she has already carried more weight than any man in this family. I rose and walked back to the car, leaving behind silence, not grief. The night seemed to breathe with me, steady, unafraid. Legacy wasn't inheritance, it was impact, and mine had only just begun.